Moving into Willow Creek Estates felt like stepping into a fairy tale. After years of renting tiny apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors, I finally had a place I could call my own. The house was perfect. A cozy 3-bedroom with large windows that let in sunlight during the day, and a small backyard where I imagined sipping coffee on lazy Sunday mornings. It wasn't just the house, though. The neighborhood seemed idyllic, with neatly trimmed lawns, flower beds bursting with color, and streets so quiet you could hear birds chirping. Everything about it screamed home. But there was one thing I didn't fully understand at first: the Homeowners Association, or HOA. At the welcome meeting, they handed out stacks of papers filled with rules. Rules for almost everything. No parking on driveways after 8 p.m. No laundry lines visible from the street. Even the color of your front door had to be approved by a committee. Honestly, I thought it was a little over the top, but everyone else seemed fine with it, so I figured I'd adjust. That's when I met Karen. She wasn't just any member of the HOA. She practically ran the whole show. Karen was always around, clipboard in hand, inspecting people's yards and leaving notes taped to their doors. Her presence was hard to ignore. She wore designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly styled hair, and her voice carried an air of authority that made even grown men squirm. To say she took her role seriously would be an understatement. Some neighbors whispered that she treated the HOA guidelines like gospel, punishing anyone who dared step out of line. At first, I tried to stay under her radar. I followed the rules as best as I could, making sure my trash bins were tucked away properly and keeping my car parked in the garage overnight. But no matter how careful I was, something always seemed to catch her attention. One week, it was the wind chime hanging near my porch. "Too noisy," she said. Another time, it was the potted plants lining my driveway. Cluttered appearance. Each note left me feeling more frustrated, but I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. What I didn't realize was that Karen wasn't done with me yet. Not long after moving in, I started noticing subtle changes in how she looked at me. Her visits became more frequent, her criticisms sharper. Then came the incident that changed everything. On a warm Wednesday afternoon, I decided to take a break from work and sit outside in my backyard. My blood sugar levels had been unstable lately, so I brought my insulin pump along to keep track of things. This device wasn't just important, it was essential. Without it, managing my type 1 diabetes would be nearly impossible. I was sitting peacefully, enjoying the fresh air, when suddenly Karen appeared. She stormed across my lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, and stopped right in front of me. Her eyes locked onto the insulin pump clipped to my belt. Before I could explain what it was, she pointed at it accusingly. "Is that some kind of decoration?" she demanded. "Because if it is, it violates our rules about unsightly personal items being displayed outdoors." I stared at her, stunned. Did she really not know what this was? "It's not decorative," I replied, trying to stay calm. "It's medical equipment. I need it to manage my diabetes." Karen didn't look convinced. In fact, she rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, come on. You're young. You don't need that." And before I could stop her, she reached out and snatched the pump right off my belt. For a moment, I couldn't believe what had happened. My heart raced as panic set in. That pump wasn't just expensive, it was my lifeline. Without it, I was putting my health at serious risk. Yet Karen held it tightly, refusing to give it back unless I proved it was medically necessary. How could someone be so cruel? All I wanted was to live quietly in my new home. But now, thanks to Karen, I found myself facing a fight I never asked for. The moment Karen walked away with my insulin pump, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My hands trembled as I sat there in disbelief, staring at the empty spot on my belt where the device should have been. It wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was part of me, something I relied on every single day to stay alive. Without it, I couldn't monitor or adjust my insulin levels, which meant my blood sugar could spike or drop dangerously at any moment. The thought made my chest tighten with panic. I tried calling after her, my voice shaking. "Karen, please. You don't understand how serious this is." But she didn't even glance back. Instead, she marched across my lawn like she hadn't just taken something critical to my survival. Her clipboard swung confidently at her side, and her heels clicked against the pavement as if she owned the entire neighborhood. Watching her disappear into her house left me feeling powerless, like I'd been punched in the gut but couldn't fight back. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do now? I needed that pump. Not tomorrow, not later today, but right then. I pulled out my phone and dialed my doctor's office, explaining what had happened while tears welled up in my eyes. They told me to stay calm and avoid eating anything until we figured things out, but staying calm was easier said than done. Every second without my pump felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my ears, and my hands grew clammy as fear took over. What if Karen refused to give it back? What if she decided to make this some kind of twisted power play? Later that evening, still reeling from the shock, I called Karen. My voice shook as I demanded she return my property. "Karen, you can't keep my insulin pump. It's not just equipment, it's life-saving medical technology. I need it." Her response hit me like a slap in the face. She laughed, a cold, dismissive laugh, and said, "Oh, stop being so dramatic. If you really needed it, you'd have mentioned it at the last HOA meeting. Besides, I'll believe it's necessary when you show me proof." Proof? Was she serious? Did she think I was lying about having diabetes? I wanted to scream at her, to tell her exactly how dangerous her actions were, but I knew it wouldn't help. Arguing with Karen only seemed to fuel her ego, and I needed to focus on getting my pump back before things got worse. So I swallowed my anger and hung up, determined to find another way to handle this. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house startled me, making me wonder if my blood sugar was dropping. I kept checking my glucose levels manually using test strips, but without the pump to regulate them automatically, I felt completely exposed. Normally, my pump did all the work for me, calculating doses and delivering insulin as needed. Now I was stuck guessing, hoping I wouldn't accidentally overdose or underdose myself. The stress was unbearable. By morning, I realized I couldn't deal with this alone. I needed support, not just emotionally, but practically too. I reached out to a close friend who lived nearby, someone I trusted to listen without judgment. When I explained what had happened, her jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me?" she said. "She actually took your insulin pump. That's insane." Together, we came up with a plan. First, I contacted my doctor again, asking for written documentation proving the necessity of my pump. Then, I started documenting everything. Screenshots of my calls with Karen, photos of my empty insulin sites, notes about how my health was already starting to suffer. If Karen wanted proof, I'd give her more than she bargained for. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. As I looked around the neighborhood, I noticed other residents avoiding eye contact or hurrying past Karen's house. There was a tension in the air, a shared unease that no one dared to talk about openly. It was clear I wasn't the first person she'd targeted, and unless something changed, I wouldn't be the last either. As frustrating as the situation was, it lit a fire inside me. I wasn't going to let Karen win. Not only did I need to get my pump back, but I also needed to stand up for everyone else who had been silenced by her bullying. This wasn't just about one stolen device. It was about taking back control of our lives. And I was ready to fight. The next morning, I woke up exhausted but determined. Sleep had been impossible. Every sound outside made me jump, and my anxiety kept me tossing and turning. My blood sugar levels were already unstable, and without my insulin pump, I felt like I was walking a tightrope with no safety net. But lying in bed wasn't going to solve anything. It was time to take action. I started by knocking on doors. At first, I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish. Would anyone even talk to me? Karen's reputation loomed large over the neighborhood, and I'd heard whispers about how intimidating she could be. Still, I had to try. If I wanted to fight back, I needed allies, people who understood just how far Karen's behavior had gone. My first few attempts didn't go well. One neighbor slammed the door in my face before I could finish explaining why I was there. Another mumbled something about not wanting trouble and quickly retreated inside. But then I met Joe and Linda, an elderly couple who lived 2 houses down. They invited me in, offering me a cup of tea while they listened to my story. When I told them about Karen stealing my insulin pump, their faces turned pale. She did what? Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. That's beyond cruel. Joe nodded grimly. This isn't the first time she's done something like this, he said. He went on to explain how Karen had fined them $500 last summer for leaving a welcome mat outside their front door. We paid it because we didn't want any more headaches, but honestly, it felt ridiculous. As we talked, other stories poured out. A young family across the street revealed that Karen had threatened to tow their guests' cars during a birthday party because someone parked on the street instead of in their driveway. Another neighbor confessed that she'd stopped planting flowers in her garden after Karen accused her of disrupting visual harmony. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using them to control everyone around her. But not everyone was willing to stay silent anymore. By the end of the day, I had gathered a small group of neighbors ready to stand with me. We decided to meet secretly in my garage later that evening to figure out our next steps. No one wanted Karen to catch wind of what we were planning. Not yet, anyway. That night, as we huddled together under flickering fluorescent lights, the mood shifted from fear to determination. Someone brought snacks. Another brought a whiteboard so we could brainstorm ideas. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek, I felt like I wasn't alone. These people weren't just neighbors. They were potential partners in taking down Karen's reign of terror. One suggestion stood out immediately: drafting a petition. If enough residents signed it, we could demand Karen's removal as HOA president. The idea gave us hope, but we knew it wouldn't be easy. Many homeowners were still too scared to speak up, and convincing them to join us would take work. Still, we agreed to start small, reaching out to trusted friends and family members within the community. Another neighbor suggested contacting local news outlets. If people see how unreasonable she's being, maybe it'll pressure her to back off, he said. The thought of going public made me nervous. I didn't want to become the center of attention, but it also felt like a necessary step. After all, Karen thrived in secrecy. Exposing her actions might be the only way to stop her. By the time the meeting ended, I felt a spark of hope I hadn't felt in days. We weren't just fighting for my insulin pump anymore. We were fighting for our freedom. And though Karen still held all the power, at least now we had a plan. As I locked my garage door behind me, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and my nerves were stretched thin. I hadn't slept much the night before, tossing and turning as I rehearsed what I would say. The petition we'd drafted had gained traction, more signatures than I'd hoped for, but I knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. She thrived on intimidation, and I was about to step into her territory. As I walked into the community center, I could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors filed in quietly, some avoiding eye contact, while others shot me nervous glances. A few gave me subtle nods of encouragement, letting me know they were on my side. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual clipboard in hand, looking as polished and unbothered as ever. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, lingering on me for just a moment too long. I felt my stomach twist, but I forced myself to keep my chin up. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up, clutching my folder filled with evidence. My hands trembled slightly, but I took a deep breath and began. I'm here today because something happened that can't be ignored, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Last week, Karen took something from me, something vital to my health and survival. My insulin pump. A murmur rippled through the room. Some people looked shocked, others uncomfortable, but Karen's expression didn't change. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms like she was bored already. "This isn't just about me," I continued, raising my voice slightly to make sure everyone heard. "It's about how far someone is willing to go to enforce rules that don't even make sense." Karen accused me of violating an HOA guideline by having my pump outside. But here's the thing. It's not decorative. It's medical equipment. I need it to live. I paused, pulling out the letter from my doctor. This document confirms that my insulin pump is essential for managing my type 1 diabetes. Without it, I risked serious complications, maybe even death. And yet Karen refused to return it unless I proved its necessity. Karen smirked, cutting in before I could finish. "Prove it," she said loudly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Show us your proof." So I did. I read aloud from the letter, detailing exactly why my pump was non-negotiable. Then I showed photos of my empty insulin sites, explaining how unstable my blood sugar had been since she'd taken it. The room grew quieter with each word, the weight of the situation sinking in. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across Karen's face. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confidence wavering. But I wasn't done. I turned to the rest of the group, holding up the petition. "This isn't just my fight anymore. Dozens of you have signed this because you're tired of living in fear, tired of being told what color your front door has to be, or where you can park your car. We deserve better than this." The room erupted in murmurs. People exchanged glances, nodding slowly as if realizing they weren't alone in their frustrations. Even those who hadn't signed the petition seemed affected. One woman stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "She fined us for putting up holiday lights last December," she said, pointing at Karen. "We paid because we didn't want trouble. But enough is enough." Another neighbor chimed in, sharing how Karen had threatened legal action over a harmless backyard shed. Each story added fuel to the fire, and soon the meeting felt less like a discussion and more like an uprising. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising above the noise, but no one listened. For once, she wasn't in control. By the time the meeting ended, the mood had shifted completely. The board members called an emergency vote to review Karen's actions, promising transparency moving forward. As I left the community center, exhaustion hit me like a wave, but I couldn't stop smiling. This battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I truly believed we might win. The days following the HOA meeting felt like a whirlwind. Word of what had happened spread quickly through Willow Creek, and soon, everyone was talking about Karen's behavior, not just within the neighborhood, but beyond it. Someone leaked the story to a local news station, and before I knew it, reporters were parked outside Karen's house, microphones in hand, asking for her side of the story. She tried to play it cool at first, brushing off questions with vague statements about maintaining community standards. But as more neighbors came forward with their own experiences, her carefully crafted image began to crack. I'll never forget the look on her face when she saw the headlines online. HOA president accused of bullying residents over medical needs, and Willow Creek neighbors rally against controlling HOA leader. It was equal parts shock and fury. For someone who thrived on control, seeing herself portrayed as the villain must have been unbearable. Still, she refused to back down, insisting that everything she did was for the good of the community. Meanwhile, the HOA board held an emergency session behind closed doors. They reviewed the petition, listened to testimonies from residents, and examined the evidence we'd gathered, including my doctor's letter and photos of my empty insulin sites. By the time they emerged, their decision was clear. Karen was stripped of her title as HOA president, effective immediately. Not only that, but she was banned from attending future meetings or holding any leadership role within the association. When the news broke, the neighborhood erupted in cheers. Some people even brought out champagne to celebrate. For years, Karen had ruled with an iron fist, making life miserable for anyone who dared step out of line. Now finally, she was gone. But the victory didn't come without consequences. While most neighbors embraced the change, others remained cautious, worried that speaking up might invite retaliation. There were still lingering fears. What if Karen found another way to cause trouble? What if someone else like her took her place one day? These questions weighed heavily on me, but I reminded myself that progress often came in small steps. We'd taken the first step together, and that was something worth celebrating. Karen didn't go quietly. In fact, she fought tooth and nail to defend herself, accusing us of exaggerating her actions and claiming she'd only been trying to uphold the rules. But her excuses fell flat. The more she protested, the more ridiculous she sounded. Even her closest allies started distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with her toxic behavior. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Joe and Linda stopped by to thank me. "You've done something incredible," Linda said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We've lived here for over 20 years, and this is the first time I feel like we can breathe again." Her words stayed with me long after they left. It wasn't just about getting my insulin pump back. It was about giving people permission to stand up for themselves. Before this, many of us had accepted Karen's bullying because we thought there was nothing we could do. But now, we'd proven that collective action could make a difference. Still, the scars ran deep. Every time I looked at my pump, I remembered the panic and helplessness I'd felt when Karen snatched it away. Those emotions wouldn't disappear overnight, but neither would the lessons I'd learned. I realized that sometimes, fighting for your rights meant risking discomfort, and maybe even danger. But letting fear silence you only gave power to those who sought to control you. As the weeks passed, things slowly returned to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now exchanged friendly waves and smiles. Kids played freely in the streets again, and laughter echoed through the air. Willow Creek was starting to feel like home in ways it never had before. Karen's house eventually went up for sale, though she rarely showed her face outside anymore. Her absence left a void, but it also created space for something better, a sense of unity among the rest of us. We weren't perfect, and rebuilding trust would take time, but we were moving forward, together. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. With Karen officially removed from her position and banned from future involvement in the HOA, the neighborhood began to heal, but the scars of her reign still lingered. For weeks, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Would she retaliate somehow, try to rally support and reclaim her power, or worse, target me directly for exposing her behavior? Her silence was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that she was done fighting, at least publicly. Still, the aftermath of the battle weighed on me. Every time I glanced at my insulin pump, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to losing control of my health. The experience had left me shaken, not just because of what Karen did, but because of how easily she could have gotten away with it if no one had spoken up. It made me realize how fragile our sense of security can be when someone abuses their authority. Karen's house sat empty for months, a constant reminder of everything that had happened. Neighbors joked about turning it into a community garden or painting it bright pink to spite her legacy, but nothing ever came of those ideas. Eventually, a young family moved in, a couple with 2 kids who seemed eager to fit in and start fresh. They waved hello during walks and even invited us over for cookies one afternoon. Watching them settle in felt symbolic, like the neighborhood was finally closing the chapter on Karen's era and opening a new one. In the meantime, the HOA underwent significant changes. A new committee took over, led by a soft-spoken man named Greg who prioritized fairness and transparency. Gone were the nitpicky rules about flower colors and mailbox designs. Instead, they focused on practical matters like road maintenance and organizing seasonal events. For the first time, the HOA meetings felt collaborative rather than combative. People spoke freely, sharing concerns without fear of being shut down or punished. But perhaps the biggest change was within the community itself. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now went out of their way to connect. Someone started a Facebook group where we could share updates, organize yard sales, and plan block parties. Another neighbor suggested starting a monthly book club, which quickly gained traction. Even Joe and Linda, who had always kept to themselves, began hosting Friday evening coffee gatherings in their driveway. Willow Creek was transforming, not overnight, but steadily, and it felt good to be part of something positive. For me personally, the experience taught lessons I wouldn't soon forget. Standing up to Karen hadn't been easy, and there were moments when I questioned whether it was worth the trouble. But looking around at the newfound camaraderie among residents, I knew it had been. We'd taken back our neighborhood, not just from Karen, but from the culture of fear she'd created. And while I wished I hadn't had to go through such an ordeal to get here, I also recognized that adversity often brings people together in unexpected ways. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping tea, I noticed Sarah from across the street walking toward me. She carried a plate covered in foil, her smile warm and genuine. "I wanted to thank you," she said, handing me the dish. Inside was a homemade lasagna, still warm from the oven. "You stood up for all of us, and I'll never forget that." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. All those sleepless nights, tense confrontations, and moments of doubt suddenly felt worthwhile. "It wasn't just me," I replied finally. "We did this together." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. "Maybe so, but you were the one brave enough to start it." With that, she gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze and headed back home, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a delicious-smelling lasagna. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the neighborhood, I allowed myself a rare moment of peace. The fight against Karen had changed me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I was stronger now, more confident in my ability to stand up for myself and others. But I was also softer, more appreciative of the little things, like kind neighbors, quiet evenings, and the simple joy of feeling safe in my own home. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But it was ours, and that made all the difference. Months have passed since the day Karen was stripped of her power, and life in Willow Creek feels almost unrecognizable. The neighborhood has undergone a quiet transformation, not flashy or dramatic, but meaningful all the same. Where once there was tension and fear, now there's laughter and connection. It's strange how much can change when people feel safe enough to let their guard down. My insulin pump sits securely on my belt again, a constant reminder of everything I went through. Some days, I glance at it and feel a pang of frustration, remembering the panic of losing it. But more often than not, I see it as a symbol of resilience. That tiny device didn't just save my health. It sparked a chain reaction that brought our community closer together. Without it, I might never have realized how strong we could be when we stood united. Karen's house eventually sold, and the new owners couldn't be more different from her. They're warm, approachable, and genuinely interested in being part of the neighborhood. Their kids ride bikes down the street, laughing as they race each other to the corner. Watching them reminds me of why I fell in love with Willow Creek in the first place. Its charm lies not in perfect lawns or matching mailboxes, but in the people who call it home. The HOA continues to evolve under Greg's leadership. He holds regular meetings where everyone's voice is heard, and decisions are made democratically rather than dictatorially. Recently, he proposed using some of the leftover funds to build a small playground for children, a project that would have been unthinkable during Karen's reign. When the idea passed unanimously, I felt a swell of pride knowing we'd come so far. Still, I think about Karen sometimes, not because I miss her, but because she taught me something important. She showed me what happens when unchecked power goes to someone's head, but she also showed me the strength of standing up against it. If anything, she made me braver. These days, I don't hesitate to speak up if something doesn't sit right with me. Whether it's questioning an unfair policy or supporting a neighbor in need, I know my voice matters, and so does theirs. Life isn't without challenges, of course. Managing diabetes is still a daily balancing act, and there are moments when stress gets the better of me. But even then, I remind myself of how far I've come. There's comfort in knowing I'm surrounded by people who care, not just about rules or appearances, but about each other. One Saturday morning, as I watered the wildflowers blooming in my front yard, Sarah stopped by with her son. "Mind if we pick a few?" she asked, gesturing to the vibrant blooms. "We're making bouquets for the senior center." "Of course," I said, smiling. "Take as many as you want." As they gathered handfuls of petals, giggling and chatting, I thought about how much had changed since those early days of living here. Back then, I wouldn't have dared plant wildflowers. They were too chaotic for Karen's taste. Now, they felt like freedom. Later that afternoon, I joined Joe and Linda for coffee on their driveway. We talked about everything from gardening tips to plans for the upcoming block party. At one point, Linda leaned over and patted my hand. "You know," she said softly, "you saved us all in your own way." Her words caught me off guard, but this time, I didn't brush them aside. Maybe she was right. Maybe standing up to Karen wasn't just about reclaiming my insulin pump. Maybe it was about reminding everyone, including myself, that no one should live in fear of doing what's right. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I sat on my porch and took a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, and the sound carried on the breeze like music. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. Willow Creek isn't perfect, and neither am I, but perfection isn't the goal anymore. What matters is that we're building something real, something rooted in kindness, trust, and courage. And as I looked around at the neighborhood I'd fought so hard to protect, I knew one thing for certain: we were going to be okay.